A poor single mother is kicked out with her elderly mother from her uncle's house, but what they find changes everything. If you want to discover the incredible turn of fate, subscribe now. Tell us which city you are listening from today. Now let's begin. The slam of the oak door was a sound of absolute finality. It was not just the closing of a door, but the closing of a life, the end of an entire chapter written in the familiar rooms of the house where Elena had been born. The sharp crack echoed in the unnervingly still air, a gunshot marking the death of her past. Outside, under a leaden-gray sky that promised a cold, unforgiving rain, Elena stood trembling, not from the chill, but from the sheer, brutal shock of the betrayal. In her arms, her 6-month-old son, Leo, stirred and whimpered, his small body a fragile, warm weight against her chest. Beside her, her grandmother, Sophia, stood ramrod straight, a pillar of defiance carved from aged, brittle stone. Her dignity was a shield, but Elena could see the tremor in her wrinkled hands, the deep, wounded pain in her dark eyes. "Get out," her uncle Luis had hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. His face, usually florid and jovial, when there was something to be gained, was a mask of cruel, pinched greed. "This house is ours now. The paperwork is clear. Your mother left nothing but debts. You and this creature are trespassing." He had gestured dismissively at baby Leo, and a fire of pure, righteous rage had ignited in Elena's chest, briefly burning away the fog of grief and fear. How could he? How could her own mother's brother speak of her child that way? Her other uncle, Jorge, stood behind Luis, his gaze fixed on the floor. He was a shadow of his brother, a man made of weaker material, his complicity born of cowardice rather than outright malice. He flinched when Elena's gaze fell on him, a twitch of guilt in his sallow face. He knew this was wrong. He knew it in his bones. But his fear of Luis was greater than his conscience. They were like vultures who had been waiting patiently for her mother to pass, and now they were descending on the carcass of her life. Sophia had been the one to speak, her voice, though frail, cutting through the tense air with the sharp edge of moral clarity. "You are a disgrace, Luis, a disgrace to your father's memory. This was his house. This was your sister's house." Luis had laughed, a short, barking sound devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a predator enjoying its power. "The old woman is sentimental. The law is not sentimental, Mother. The law says the house is ours. Now get out before I have you removed." He took a step toward Sophia, his posture a clear physical threat. That was when Elena had moved, placing herself between her uncle and her grandmother. "Don't you dare," she had said, her voice low and shaking, but filled with a protective fury she didn't know she possessed. "Don't you dare touch her." For a moment, Luis looked surprised, as if a kitten had suddenly roared like a lion. Then his lip curled into a cruel smile. He saw no threat here. He saw only a frightened girl, a crying baby, and a frail old woman. He saw weakness. "Go on, then," he sneered, gesturing to the open road. "Go be a strong woman somewhere else." And so they had walked. Elena had refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. She had turned her back on the only home she had ever known, packed a single flimsy cardboard suitcase with a few of Leo's clothes and her mother's old photo album, and walked away. With each step, she felt the memory of her mother's last warning echoing in her soul. "Never trust them, Elena." Her mother had whispered from her sickbed, her voice thin as paper. "Their hearts are full of stones." Elena hadn't understood the depth of that warning then. Now, she did. The stones in their hearts had crushed her world. She clutched Leo tighter, his warmth a small anchor in the vast, cold emptiness that was her new reality. She made a silent vow, not to her uncles, but to her son, to her grandmother, and to the memory of her mother. She would not break. She would survive. Somehow. The road stretched before them, a long black ribbon of asphalt disappearing into a hazy, indifferent horizon. The world felt enormous and empty. Cars and trucks sped past, their occupants faceless and anonymous, cocooned in their own lives, oblivious to the three tiny desperate figures walking along the shoulder. The wind picked up, whipping Elena's hair across her face and carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It was a lonely, desolate smell that seemed to mirror the hollowness inside her. Sophia walked beside her, her steps slow but steady. She did not complain. She did not weep. She simply walked, her gaze fixed forward, as if she could see a destination that was invisible to Elena. Every few minutes Elena would glance at her heart aching with a mixture of love and guilt. Her grandmother was in her 70s. She should have been resting in a comfortable chair, telling stories to her great-grandson, not being forced into a desperate exodus on a barren highway. This was her fault. If she had been stronger, smarter, if she had fought them harder, after what felt like an eternity, with the sun beginning to dip below the horizon and painting the leaden sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Sophia finally faltered. "Elena," she said, her voice raspy. "We must rest for a moment." They found a large, flat rock by the side of the road, partially shielded by a cluster of dry, thorny bushes. Elena gently lowered her grandmother onto the rock, then sat beside her, shifting Leo in her arms. The baby, sensing the tension and exhaustion, began to cry. It was a thin, piercing wail that seemed to be pulled from the very center of Elena's own despair. She tried to soothe him, rocking him gently, murmuring soft words, but his cries only grew louder. The sound transported her back in time, to another moment of crushing rejection. She was sitting in a brightly lit cafe, the smell of coffee and pastries thick in the air. Across from her sat Marco, Leo's father. His face, which she had once found so handsome, was closed and hard. She had just told him she was pregnant. "I can't," he had said, not even looking at her. He stared out the window, at the people passing by on the street, as if she were a minor inconvenience he wished would just disappear. "I have plans, a career. This wasn't supposed to happen." "It did happen, Marco," she had pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "We happened." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were cold, devoid of the affection she had once seen there. "It was a mistake," he said, the words like chips of ice. "And that," he gestured vaguely toward her stomach, "that is your problem, not mine." He had stood up, thrown a few bills on the table, and walked out of her life without a backward glance. Two great betrayals by the men who should have protected her, her lover and her uncles. They had both looked at her and her child, and seen only a burden, a problem to be discarded. Leo's cries brought her back to the present, to the cold rock and the dying light. The tears she had refused to shed in front of her uncles now streamed down her face, hot and silent. She was so utterly alone. Sophia reached out and placed a wrinkled hand on her arm. Her touch was surprisingly firm. "Do not cry for them, my child," she said softly. Elena looked up, surprised. It was as if her grandmother had read her thoughts. "Men like that, they are not worth your tears. They are hollow inside." "But what are we going to do, Abuela?" Elena whispered, the question a raw ache in her throat. "Where will we go?" Sophia gazed out at the darkening landscape. "I do not know," she admitted. But I know we will not be defeated by their wickedness. Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew. You have her strength in you, Elena. It is like a deep well. You just have not had to draw from it until now." She paused, her eyes finding Elena's in the twilight. "And do not let hate for them poison you. Hate is a poison you drink yourself, expecting the other person to die. We do not have time for poison. We only have time for survival." Her grandmother's words, simple and wise, settled over Elena's heart like a warm blanket. They did not change their circumstances, but they changed something inside of her. The despair receded, replaced by a flicker of grim determination. Sophia was right. She was her mother's daughter. She had a son to protect. She had her grandmother to care for. There was no room for anything but moving forward. As if on cue, the distant rumble of an engine grew louder. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom, approaching them. Hope, fragile and desperate, fluttered in Elena's chest. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe someone would help. She stood up, ready to wave, but the vehicle, a large pickup truck, roared past without slowing down, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust and grit that washed over them, choking her, stinging her eyes. The red taillights vanished into the darkness, leaving them more alone than before. The brief spark of hope was extinguished, leaving only the bitter taste of dust in her mouth. She sank back down onto the rock, defeated. Night was falling fast, and the desert air was growing colder. Fear, a cold and creeping thing, began to wind its way around her heart again. They could not stay here. It was not safe. But where could they go? It was then, as her eyes scanned the horizon one last time, that she saw it. Far off the road, almost swallowed by the vast empty landscape and semi-hidden by a grove of skeletal mesquite trees, was a dark, angular shape against the deep purple sky, a structure. It looked old and abandoned, a forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere. It was probably nothing, a ruin, unsafe, but it was also a possibility. It was shelter. "Abuela," Elena said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and a strange, irrational hope. "Look." Sophia followed her gaze. She squinted, her old eyes struggling in the dim light. "A house?" "I think so," Elena breathed. "It's a long way from the road, but it's something." The decision was made without another word. Fueled by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Elena helped her grandmother to her feet. With Leo now sleeping soundly against her shoulder, she took Sophia's arm, and they left the cold security of the road, stepping into the untamed desert, their feet sinking into the soft sand as they walked toward the distant, lonely silhouette. Each step was an act of faith, a gamble against the encroaching darkness. They were walking into nothingness, praying to find something. The walk to the house was longer and more difficult than it had looked. Thorny bushes snagged at their clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to trip them with every step. The silence of the desert was immense, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the crunch of their own footsteps. As they drew closer, the structure took shape. It was an old adobe house, its walls the color of the earth itself, its roofline slumped and weary. It looked as if it had grown out of the desert and was slowly being reclaimed by it. It was clear no one had lived there for a very, very long time. Decades, perhaps. A surge of apprehension washed over Elena. What if it was full of snakes or other creatures? What if the roof was about to collapse? But the alternative was sleeping out in the open, exposed to the cold, and whatever else lurked in the night. This ruin was their only hope. The front door hung slightly ajar, tilted on a single rusty hinge. It creaked open under Elena's tentative push, the sound groaning through the silent house like a suffering soul. A thick, musty smell of dust, decay, and ancient memories washed over them. Elena hesitated on the threshold, peering into the cavernous darkness within. Then, taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, Sophia following closely behind her. Inside, the air was still and surprisingly dry. Faint moonlight filtered through a grimy window, illuminating a large single room. Shapes of old furniture huddled under ghostly white sheets of dust. A stone fireplace, black with soot and draped in cobwebs, dominated one wall. In one corner, a small kitchenette was barely visible, with a few rusted cans still sitting on a shelf. It was a place frozen in time, a testament to a life abruptly abandoned. But it was solid. The walls were thick, and the roof, though sagging, was intact. It was shelter. It was protection from the biting wind. A wave of profound relief washed over Elena, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. They were safe, at least for the night. She carefully navigated through the dusty room and found a smaller adjoining room. It must have been a bedroom. Inside, against the far wall, stood a simple wooden bed frame, and next to it, a small wooden crib. The sight of the crib sent a strange shiver down her spine. It was as if the house had been waiting for them, for a mother and a child. For the first time since the door of her home had slammed shut, a tiny, fragile spark of something other than fear ignited within her. It was not quite hope, but a distant cousin of it. Them. They spent the first night huddled together on the floor of the bedroom, using the dusty sheets from the furniture as makeshift blankets. It was cold and uncomfortable, but they were out of the wind. Elena lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the old house settling around them, her hand resting protectively on Leo's small back. The next morning, Elena awoke to the sun streaming through the dirty window pane, casting long golden bars of light across the dusty floor. The world looked different in the daylight, less threatening. Her first priority was water. She explored the area around the house and, to her astonishment, found an old stone-lined well with a rusted hand pump. With a surge of desperate strength, she began to work the handle. It screeched and groaned in protest, but after several minutes of frantic effort, a trickle of brown, murky water sputtered from the spout, slowly clearing until it ran cool and clean. Water. It was life. She laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, and drank deeply. That small victory gave her a new surge of energy. Back inside, she began to explore the kitchenette more thoroughly. The rusted cans were useless, but tucked away in a wooden cupboard, she found several cloth sacks. Her heart pounded as she opened them. Inside one was dried beans. Inside another, rice. They were old, dusty, and probably home to a few insects. But they were food, real food. With water and food, they could survive here for a while. They could make this place a refuge. The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Elena found an old pot and boiled water from the well over a small fire she managed to start in the fireplace, using dry twigs and a book of matches she found in her suitcase. While Sophia sat in a dusty armchair, cradling a cooing Leo, Elena swept the floors, beat the dust out of the old sheets, and scrubbed the small bedroom clean. As she worked, transforming the space from a forgotten tomb into a humble, livable shelter, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. "This place," Sophia said from her chair, her voice thoughtful. "It feels familiar somehow. The smell of the adobe in the sun. It reminds me of my childhood." Elena paused in her sweeping. "Did you ever come out this way, Abuela?" Sophia shook her head slowly. "No, not that I can remember. Your grandfather Arturo and we always stayed closer to town. But still, there is something about it." She fell silent, lost in a distant memory. A few days passed. A routine began to form. Mornings were for fetching water and cleaning. Afternoons were for resting out of the hot sun. Evenings were for a simple meal of beans and rice, eaten by the light of the fire. It was a hard, spare existence, but it was peaceful. There were no cruel words, no threatening presence. There was only the vast, silent desert and the three of them. It was during her efforts to clean the great stone fireplace that she made the discovery. As she was scrubbing away decades of soot from the hearth, her hand brushed against a brick that felt loose. Curiosity piqued. She wiggled it. It moved. Her breath caught in her throat. Using the end of a fire poker, she carefully pried the brick out of its place. Behind it was a dark, hollow space. And inside that space, something was hidden. Her hands trembled as she reached into the darkness. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of a wooden box. It was old and heavy. With a surge of adrenaline, she pulled it out into the light. It was a simple, dark wood box, about the size of a shoebox, with a rusted metal latch. What could be inside? Money, jewelry, a treasure hidden away by whoever had lived here before. She carried it over to the fire, where Sophia was watching, her eyes wide with anticipation. "What is it, child?" "I don't know," Elena breathed. She worked the rusted latch with her fingernails, her heart pounding against her ribs. Finally, with a rusty groan, it sprang open. She lifted the lid. There was no gold, no jewels. The box was filled with a bundle of old letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon and a small leather-bound diary. A wave of disappointment washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper curiosity. This was not a treasure of wealth, but a treasure of secrets. Carefully, she lifted the letters out. The paper was brittle with age. The ink was faded. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. It was dated over 50 years ago. "My dearest Arturo," it began. Elena's eyes widened. She looked at her grandmother. Arturo. That was grandfather's name. Sophia leaned forward, her expression a mixture of confusion and shock. "Read it," she whispered. Elena began to read aloud. The letters were from a woman named Isabella. They were love letters, filled with passion, longing, and secrets. Isabella wrote of how she had met Arturo when he was working on a project far from town, how she, a migrant worker, had cared for him when he fell ill with a fever. She wrote of their secret meetings, of the deep, powerful love that had grown between them, a love they had to hide from the world. Sophia listened in stunned silence, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "My Arturo," she murmured, her voice thick with a lifetime of memories now being rewritten. A whole life, and I knew nothing of this. There was no anger in her voice, only a profound, quiet sadness for the secrets her husband had carried. Then came the letter that changed everything. In it, Isabella confessed to Arturo that she was pregnant with his child. The subsequent letters were filled with a mix of joy and terror. What would they do? How could they be a family? With trembling hands, Elena set the letters aside and picked up the small leather diary. The entries, written in the same elegant script, filled in the rest of the story. Arturo, it turned out, had used his own hands and his own money to build this very adobe house, this secret refuge in the desert for Isabella and their child. This was meant to be their home. Elena's heart was hammering. She read on, her voice barely a whisper. A son was born. They named him Miguel. For a few short, blissful months, they had lived here as a family. But their secret was fragile. The final entries were frantic, filled with fear. Someone had discovered their existence. Isabella wrote of threats, of danger. She had to flee, to take her son somewhere safe where they would never be found. The last entry was short and heartbreaking. I must go. I leave this house, our home, behind. I pray one day my son can return to the legacy his father built for him. I will protect him, my love. I will change his name. I will disappear. Tears streamed down Elena's face as she closed the diary. This house wasn't just an abandoned ruin. It was a monument to a secret love story, a home built for a family torn apart. It was a part of her own history she had never known. Her grandfather had another son. Her mother had a half-brother. She had an uncle she never knew existed. As she placed the diary back in the box, her fingers brushed against something underneath a false bottom. She lifted it. It was a single, folded document, an official-looking paper yellowed with age. She carefully unfolded it. It was a property deed, the deed to this house and the surrounding 10 acres of land. And the name on the deed, the legal owner of this property, was Miguel, son of Arturo and Isabella. Elena dropped to her knees, the deed clutched in her hand. The sheer staggering weight of the revelation hit her. This wasn't just a shelter they had stumbled upon by chance. This was their birthright. This was their legacy. The villains who had cast them out, her own uncles, had no claim here. This land, this house, belonged to a branch of the family they had tried to erase. And in a twist of fate that felt like a miracle, it had saved them. Just as a slow, watery smile of disbelief and vindication began to spread across her face. A sound from outside shattered the moment. The distant growl of an engine getting closer. Headlights sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the front of the house. Panic, cold and immediate, seized her. "Abuela!" she hissed, scrambling to her feet. "Someone's here!" Sophia's face went pale. "Luis," she whispered. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. "How could they have found us?" Elena cried, her mind racing. Then she knew. The smoke from their small fire, a thin plume of survival that had become a beacon for their hunters. "Quickly!" Elena grabbed the precious box, blew out the single candle they had lit, and plunged the room into darkness. She pulled her grandmother into the small bedroom, hushing a now stirring Leo. They crouched in the dark, their hearts pounding in unison, listening as the engine cut out, followed by the slam of 2-car doors. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. They were no longer in a refuge. They were in a trap. The front door burst open with a splintering crash, kicked in with brutal force. 2 silhouettes stood framed against the night sky, their shapes monstrous and familiar. Luis and Jorge. "I knew it." Luis's voice snarled, echoing in the small house. "I saw the smoke yesterday, thought it was just kids, but I had a feeling." He stepped inside, a powerful flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the room and landing on the evidence of their inhabitants, the clean-swept floor, the pot by the hearth. "The old woman and the brat, hiding out here like rats." Jorge followed him, looking nervous and jumpy. "Luis, maybe we should just go. This place is a ruin. There's nothing here." "There's pride," Luis shot back, his voice dripping with venom. "They defied me. They think they can get away. They need to be taught a lesson." His flashlight beam danced around the room, searching. Come out, wherever you are." he called in a sing-song voice that made Elena's blood run cold. Elena held her breath, pressing herself and Leo flat against the wall in the dark bedroom. She could feel Sophia trembling beside her. They were cornered. There was nowhere to run. The beam of light swept past their doorway once, twice. Then it stopped, pointing directly into their hiding spot. "Well, well, look what we have here," Louis said, his voice laced with a triumphant, cruel satisfaction. He took a step into the bedroom, his large frame filling the doorway. He looked at Sophia, cowering on the floor, and then at Elena, clutching her baby. "Did you really think you could hide from me in this dump?" He advanced into the room. "I'll ask you one more time. Did your sister hide money? Is that what this is about? Tell me where it is, and maybe I'll let you walk away." He was so blinded by his own greed, he couldn't imagine any other motivation. Sophia, summoning her courage, spoke from the floor. "There is no money, Luis. Leave us in peace." Luis's face twisted in rage. He lunged forward and grabbed Sophia's arm. "Don't lie to me, old woman." A primal scream of fury tore from Elena's throat. All the fear, all the despair, all the grief of the past few days coalesced into a single point of incandescent rage. She shot to her feet, placing herself directly in front of her grandmother, the sleeping baby still clutched in one arm. The box with the letters was on the floor behind her. "Don't you dare touch her!" she screamed, her voice echoing with a power that stunned even herself. Luis was momentarily taken aback by her ferocity. He dropped Sophia's arm and turned his full, menacing attention to Elena. "You have a lot of nerve, you little brat," he growled, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You need to learn some respect." Just as he raised his other hand, a blindingly bright light flooded the entire house, pouring in from the broken front doorway. It was brighter than a flashlight, as powerful as a car's high beams. A deep, calm voice cut through the tension. "What is going on here?" Everyone froze. Luis dropped Elena's arm as if it were burning hot. He spun around, shielding his eyes from the intense light. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the doorway, his silhouette backlit and imposing. He was dressed in simple work clothes, but he held a large, heavy-duty flashlight that illuminated the entire scene with merciless clarity. "Who the hell are you?" Luis demanded, his voice suddenly losing its bluster, replaced by a defensive edge. The stranger took a step into the house, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The two menacing brothers, the terrified old woman on the floor, and Elena, standing defiantly with her child, her face streaked with tears and dirt. His eyes, when they met Elena's, were steady and serious. "I live a few miles from here," the man said, his voice even and authoritative. "I saw your truck tear down the service road. Figured I'd check for trespassers. Looks like I found some." He looked directly at Luis and Jorge. "Is everything okay here, ma'am?" he asked, his question directed pointedly at Elena. Before Elena could answer, Luis stepped forward. "This is a family matter. It's none of your business. We're just collecting our mother and my niece." The stranger's gaze did not waver. He looked from Luis's enraged face to Sophia's frightened one. "It doesn't look like a family reunion," he said dryly. "It looks like you broke down the door and were assaulting this young woman." He took another step into the room, and there was something about his quiet confidence, his sheer physical presence, that made both Luis and Jorge instinctively take a step back. "I know your family," the stranger continued, his eyes on Luis. "I know your reputation in town. Now I think it's time for you to leave." Luis's face contorted with fury and humiliation. He was being challenged, and in front of an audience. For a moment it looked like he might lunge at the stranger, but something in the man's steady, unblinking stare made him hesitate. He was a bully, and bullies only fought battles they were sure they could win. This was not one of them. "This isn't over," Luis snarled at Elena, his finger jabbing in her direction. "You will pay for this, both of you." He turned and stomped out of the house, his rage radiating off him in waves. Jorge, looking pale and relieved, scurried after him like a frightened dog. The sound of their truck starting up and speeding away was a roar of defeat. Silence descended on the small house, broken only by Leo's soft whimpers. The stranger lowered his flashlight, and the room was plunged back into relative darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight. Elena's legs finally gave out, and she sank to the floor, pulling her grandmother into a fierce, trembling hug. The man waited patiently by the door. "Are you all right?" he asked again, his voice softer now. Elena looked up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you. You saved us." He nodded. "My name is David," he said. He gestured vaguely to the east. "I have a small ranch a couple of miles from here. I saw the smoke from your chimney the other day. I was worried it might be a wildfire starting." He paused, his gaze taking in the squalid conditions, the single pot, the makeshift beds. "What are you doing out here?" Elena didn't know why, but she trusted him. Maybe it was the kindness in his eyes, or the calm strength with which he had faced down her uncles. She found herself telling him everything: the death of her mother, the betrayal, being kicked out of their home, the desperate journey, and the discovery of this house. David listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "This house," he said slowly, looking around the room. "My mother used to talk about a house like this, an adobe she lived in for a short time, out in this direction. She said it was the only real home she ever had." A strange feeling, a prickle of impossible coincidence, ran up Elena's spine. "Your mother?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What was her name?" "Isabella," David answered. The world seemed to stop. Elena stared at him, her mind reeling. Isabella. The name from the letters. She scrambled for the wooden box, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open the latch. She pulled out the diary and one of the letters. "Isabella?" she repeated, holding them out to him. "Did she write these?" David took the letter, his brow furrowed in confusion. He shone his flashlight on the page. His face went pale. "This is her handwriting," he whispered, his voice thick with shock. He looked from the letter to Elena, then to the diary she was holding. "Where did you get these?" "They were hidden in the fireplace," Elena said, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "They were written to my grandfather, Arturo. They speak of a secret son, a son named Miguel." David sank onto a dusty crate, the letter trembling in his hand. He stared into the darkness, his mind clearly racing through a lifetime of unanswered questions. "My mother. She never spoke of my father," he said, his voice distant. "She raised me alone. We moved around a lot when I was young. She told me she changed my name to keep me safe, to give me a new start. My birth name was Miguel." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with breathtaking force. This man, this stranger who had appeared like a guardian angel from the night, was not a stranger at all. He was Miguel. He was her mother's half-brother. He was her uncle. Sophia, who had been listening in stunned silence, slowly got to her feet. She walked over to David and looked down at him, her eyes searching his face. She saw the shape of his jaw, the color of his eyes. She saw a ghost of her husband, a man she had loved for 50 years. Tears welled in her eyes and traced new paths through the wrinkles on her cheeks. "You are my husband's son," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound certainty. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are blood of my blood. You are family." David looked up at the old woman, and then at Elena and the baby in her arms. He looked at the letters from a mother he had loved and a father he had never known. The story of his own life, a story with a gaping hole at its center, was suddenly, miraculously, complete. He was not just David, the solitary rancher. He was Miguel, son of Arturo and Isabella. He was standing in the house his father had built for his mother. And these women, this family he had just saved, were his own. A slow, determined fire lit in David's eyes, replacing the shock. He stood up, his stature seeming even taller than before. He looked at Elena, his voice firm with a newfound purpose. "You're not alone anymore," he said, the words a solemn vow. "My uncles kicked me out too, in a way. They erased me. But fate brought us all here." He gestured around the dusty room. "According to that deed, this is my house, and my house is your house." He looked toward the broken door, in the direction her uncles had fled. "They wanted to erase us. Instead, they brought us together. Tomorrow we start fighting back." The next morning marked the beginning of a transformation, not just for the house, but for all of them. David arrived at sunrise in his pickup truck, the bed loaded with supplies. There was a small generator, which he fired up with a satisfying roar, bringing light and power to the forgotten house. There were boxes of food, cans of formula for Leo, clean blankets, and tools. He brought lumber to board up the broken-down door and secure the windows. As they worked side by side, a new dynamic formed. Elena, who had felt so helpless, found a new strength in the simple physical labor. She hammered nails, scrubbed floors, and helped David patch the weakest spots in the roof. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable. She was not just sheltering in this house. She was rebuilding it. She was rebuilding her life. David was a quiet, practical man, but his actions spoke volumes. He treated Sophia with a gentle, profound respect, listening intently as she told him stories about Arturo, filling in the gaps of the father he never knew. He was endlessly patient with Leo, who quickly grew to adore this tall, calm man who could make him laugh with a simple, silly face. In the evenings, they would sit around the fire, the generator humming softly outside, and talk. They pieced together the two halves of their family's story. Elena learned about Isabella, a proud, resilient woman who had worked tirelessly to give her son a good life, always carrying the secret sadness of the love she had left behind. David learned about his father, Arturo, a good and honorable man who had been trapped by the conventions of his time. It was a story of sorrow, but in their telling of it, it became a story of connection. They were a new family, forged in betrayal and rediscovered in a dusty, abandoned house. A few days later, they made their first strategic move. David, Elena, Sophia, and the baby all piled into David's truck and drove the 2 hours to the county records office in the nearest city. Armed with the original deed, Isabella's diary, David's birth certificate showing his original name was Miguel, and a sworn, notarized statement from Sophia confirming Arturo's relationship with Isabella, they presented their case to a weary but meticulous county clerk. The clerk examined the documents for what felt like an eternity, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. He checked old property maps and dusty ledgers. Finally, he looked up, a small, satisfied smile on his face. "Everything appears to be in order," he announced. "The deed is valid. The chain of title is clear. This property was never incorporated into the estate of Arturo Garcia upon his death, as it was already deeded to his son." He stamped the documents with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Congratulations, Mr." He squinted at the paper. "David, the property is officially registered in your name." Walking out of the government building into the bright sunshine, Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was a legal, official victory. The adobe house and the land it stood on were theirs, safe from her uncle's greedy hands. "Now," David said, a grim smile on his face as he buckled Leo into his car seat. "Let's go visit my brothers." They drove not to their desert refuge, but to the house in town. The house Elena had been thrown out of. The house that should have been hers. When David knocked on the door, it was Jorge who answered. His face went white with fear when he saw not only Elena and his mother, but the tall stranger standing with them. "What do you want?" he stammered. "We're here to talk to Luis," David said, his voice calm and unyielding. Luis appeared behind Jorge, his face a thundercloud of rage. "I told you to stay away," he roared. "You have no business here." "On the contrary," David said, holding up a copy of the newly registered deed. "I have every business here. My name is David, but I was born Miguel, son of Arturo Garcia and Isabella Reyes." The color drained from Luis's face. He stared at David, then at his mother, who met his gaze with a look of cold disappointment. "What is this nonsense?" Luis blustered. "My father didn't have other children. This is a trick." "It's no trick," Sophia said, her voice steady. "I have seen the proof. I remember Isabella. This man is your brother." "He is not my brother," Luis screamed, his denial bordering on hysteria. He looked at Jorge, who was trembling, his eyes wide with dawning horror and belief. Luis saw the doubt cracking his brother's resolve, and his panic intensified. "This is our house. Get off my property." "That's another thing we need to discuss," David said coolly. "The fraudulent way you acquired this house from your sister's estate. But for now, just know this. The game has changed. You will not harass Elena or my mother again. The land you found them on is mine, and I will protect what is mine." With that, they turned and walked away, leaving Luis and Jorge standing in the doorway, their world beginning to crumble around them. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Luis, however, was not a man to accept defeat. The next day, a sheriff's department car rolled up the dirt track to the adobe house. A stern-faced deputy stepped out. Luis had called the police, claiming that squatters had illegally occupied a remote property and were holding his mother and niece against their will. The deputy listened patiently to David's side of the story, his expression skeptical. But when David produced the freshly stamped and certified property title from the county office, the officer's demeanor changed. He took the document back to his car to verify it over the radio. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Elena's heart pounded. What if something was wrong? What if Luis had some power she didn't know about? Finally, the deputy returned, handing the deed back to David. "The title is valid, sir. It was registered yesterday. As far as the law is concerned, this is your property. You are not squatters." He then turned a hard gaze on Elena. "Ma'am, are you and your grandmother here of your own free will?" "Yes, officer," Elena said, her voice clear and strong. "This is David. He's my uncle. He is protecting us." The deputy nodded, satisfied. He tipped his hat. "Sorry to have bothered you. We get malicious calls like this sometimes." He got back in his car, but before driving away, he spoke into his radio, his voice clearly audible in the quiet desert air. "Dispatch, confirm Unit 7. The call regarding the squatters on Parcel 4B is unfounded. The individuals are the legal property owner and his family. Mark the report as a possible misuse of police resources by the complainant, Luis Garcia." It was a public, official humiliation for Luis. He had tried to use the law as a weapon, and it had backfired spectacularly. They were safe. They were legally untouchable. If this story has moved you so far, if you have felt Elena's anguish and Sophia's strength, leave a like and stay until the end, because what comes now is even more exciting. With the immediate threat of her uncles neutralized, Elena felt a sense of security she hadn't known was possible. But there was one last ghost from her past that needed to be laid to rest. One more chain that needed to be broken. Marco. Leaving Leo in the loving care of Sophia and David, she took David's truck and drove into the city. She found Marco at the upscale architectural firm where he worked. He was surprised to see her, and deeply uncomfortable. He led her to a small, sterile conference room. "Elena," he said, avoiding her eyes, "what are you doing here?" "I came to tell you something," she said, her voice steady. She refused to let him see any weakness. "You have a son. His name is Leo. He is beautiful, and he is healthy." Marco shifted in his expensive chair. "Look, Elena, I told you." "I'm not here for your money." She cut him off, the words sharp and clean. "I don't want anything from you. I just thought you, as his father, had the right to know he exists, and I wanted you to know that we are okay, more than okay. Help arrived when I needed it most. But it didn't come from you." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret? Shame. He reached for his wallet. "Let me give you something for the boy." Elena stood up and held up her hand. "No," she said. "You made your choice in that cafe. You chose your plans over your son. Live with that choice. I am living with mine." She looked at the man she had once thought she loved and felt nothing but a distant pity. He was small and weak, trapped in a life built on selfishness. She was free. She walked out of that building with her head held high, the last toxic tie to her past severed. When she got back to the adobe house, David was waiting for her on the porch. He saw the look on her face, the new lightness in her eyes. "You okay?" he asked. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'm better than okay," she said. And for the first time, as she looked at the humble house, at her grandmother playing with Leo on a blanket in the sun, she thought the word, and it felt true. "Let's go home." The weeks that followed were filled with the quiet joy of building. David and Elena worked together every day, their partnership easy and natural. They repaired the well pump, planted a small garden with seeds David brought from his ranch, and built a sturdy fence around the property. Their shared work and shared history forged a bond between them that grew deeper with each passing day. Elena found herself watching him, admiring the quiet competence in his hands, the kindness in his gaze. He wasn't like Marco or her uncles. He looked at her with respect, as an equal. He looked at her like she mattered. One evening, as Elena was putting a tired Leo to bed in the old wooden crib, the baby looked up at David, who was standing in the doorway. He reached out a tiny hand and said his first real word. "Da." A profound stillness filled the room. David's breath hitched, and Elena's heart swelled with an emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. This was her family, this strange, broken, beautiful group of people brought together by fate in the middle of the desert. This was home. But their peace was a fragile thing, and the serpent was not yet vanquished. One afternoon, David returned from his ranch, his face dark and troubled. "Someone broke into my tool shed," he said quietly, so Sophia couldn't hear. "They didn't take much, just some rope and a full gas can." A cold dread washed over Elena. She knew. Instantly, she knew. It was Luis. He had been defeated legally and publicly. A man like him, consumed by pride and rage, would not let that stand. If he couldn't have the house, if he couldn't drive them out, he would do the only thing a creature of pure destruction could do. He would burn it all to the ground. The realization came to David like a bolt of lightning. The missing gas can, his brother's escalating desperation. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Luis wasn't just going to threaten them anymore. He was going to erase the problem. If the house disappeared, the proof of his father's secret life disappeared. If they were inside, even better. "Elena!" he yelled into his phone, his voice raw with panic. He was halfway back to the adobe house from his ranch, pushing his truck as fast as it would go. "He's coming for you. He's going to set fire to the house. You have to get out, grab your mother and the baby, and get out of the house, now. Run for the main road." The panic in his voice was contagious. Elena's blood ran cold. She didn't waste a second questioning him. "Abuela, now!" she screamed, snatching a sleeping Leo from his crib. "We have to go." Sophia, her face a mask of confusion and fear, was pulled to her feet. Elena grabbed the only thing that mattered besides her family, the wooden box containing Isabella's letters and the deed. She shoved it into a cloth bag and slung it over her shoulder. Together, the three of them burst out of the house and began running, not towards the dirt track, but across the open desert, toward the distant highway. It was their only hope for escape. They hadn't gotten 100 yards when the roar of an engine cut through the evening air, but it wasn't coming from the road. It was coming from across the desert. Luis's truck, bouncing and jostling over the rough terrain, was cutting them off, its headlights like the eyes of a predator closing in on its prey. The truck skidded to a halt, blocking their path. Luis leaped out of the driver's side. He was a terrifying sight. His eyes were wild, his face slick with sweat. He was completely unhinged, a man pushed past the edge of reason into pure, malevolent rage. In his hand, he held the missing red gas can. Jorge stumbled out of the passenger side, his face ashen with terror. "Luis, no," he pleaded. "Don't do this. For God's sake, stop." Luis ignored him. He stalked towards the adobe house, his movements jerky and crazed. "This house!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Everything is because of this cursed house. It poisoned my father. It brought you here. If it's gone, it's all gone." Sophia stepped forward, her body trembling but her voice firm. "Luis, my son, for the love of God, stop this madness. I am your mother." "You stopped being my mother when you chose them over me," he shrieked back, his words a spray of spittle. He reached the house and began splashing the gasoline against the old dry wooden porch and the adobe walls, the fumes thick and sickening in the air. "Please, Luis," Jorge sobbed, falling to his knees in the sand. "Don't do this to Mama. Don't do this to us." Luis was beyond hearing. He finished emptying the can, threw it aside, and fumbled in his pocket. He pulled out a lighter. The small click as he flicked it open was as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. "No!" Elena screamed. With a final triumphant snarl, Luis tossed the lighter onto the gas-soaked porch. The world erupted in a whoosh of orange and yellow. The front of the house was instantly engulfed in a wall of flame that roared toward the sky, consuming the dry wood with terrifying speed. At that exact moment, David's truck came flying down the dirt track, skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust. He leaped out before it had even stopped moving and, with a guttural roar of fury, launched himself at Luis, tackling him to the ground away from the fire. But as David subdued his brother, Elena watched in horror as the flames began to lick at the doorway of the bedroom, the room where the crib still stood, the room where they had found their first moment of peace. The bag with the box of letters had fallen from her shoulder when she started to run. It lay just inside the doorway, the flames creeping ever closer. She didn't think, she just acted. That box was their history. It was their proof. It was the foundation of their new life. She couldn't let it burn. "Elena, no!" She heard David scream, but his voice sounded far away. She covered her mouth and nose with her sleeve and ran, not away from the fire, but directly into the burning house. The heat was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Smoke filled the room, stinging her eyes. She saw the bag, just a few feet away. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the strap. As she turned to flee, a terrifying groan echoed from above. A massive, burning roof beam cracked and splintered, crashing down and blocking her exit, its flaming end pinning her leg to the floor. A scream of pure agony and terror was ripped from her throat. She was trapped. The fire was everywhere. Through the smoke and flames, a figure appeared. David. His face was a mask of grim determination. "I've got you," he yelled, his voice choked by the smoke. He tried to lift the beam, but it was too heavy. The roof was groaning, ready to collapse entirely. Seeing another way, he smashed a hole through the crumbling, fire-weakened adobe wall with his shoulder. "Crawl!" he commanded. "Crawl now!" With her legs seared by the heat and her lungs burning, Elena clawed her way through the opening David had made, still clutching the precious bag. He grabbed her under the arms and dragged her clear just as the entire roof gave way with a deafening roar, collapsing inward in a shower of sparks and embers. They lay on the ground, 20 feet from the inferno, coughing and gasping for air. The house was a funeral pyre, a roaring testament to Luis's madness, but they were alive. And in Elena's arms, clutched tightly to her chest, was the charred but intact wooden box. Then another sound cut through the roar of the fire, the rising and falling wail of sirens. David, in his panicked phone call, had not only warned Elena, he had also called 911. Police cars and a fire truck came bouncing down the track, their red and blue lights painting the horrific scene. The fight was over. Police officers swarmed the scene, pulling a struggling, ranting Luis off David and slapping him in handcuffs. Jorge, sobbing hysterically, immediately began confessing everything, his words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and fear. He became the state's primary witness on the spot. Elena watched, leaning against David, the warmth of his body a comforting anchor in the chaos. She watched them put her uncle, a man consumed by his own poison, into the back of a police car. She watched the home she had just found, the home her grandfather had built with love, be consumed by a fire born of pure hate. The house was gone, but they had survived. They had the truth, and they had each other. The fire had taken their shelter, but it had sealed their future. The adobe house was a smoldering ruin, a black scar on the desert landscape. Everything they had built, every small comfort they had created, was gone, turned to ash and charcoal. But as Elena stood in the cold desert night, wrapped in a blanket a firefighter had given her, she did not feel despair. She felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. The fire had been a terrible, violent end, but it was an end. The monster had been vanquished. David came to her side, his face smudged with soot, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. "It's gone," she whispered, looking at the glowing embers. "It's just a house, Elena," he said softly. "We'll build another one." He looked over at Sophia, who was sitting in the warm cabin of the fire truck, holding a sleeping Leo. "My ranch is only a few miles away. The house is too big for one man. There's plenty of room." He turned to face her, his eyes earnest in the flashing emergency lights. "Come live with me, not as guests, as family." Elena looked into his eyes and saw not pity, but belonging. She saw a future. She nodded, the tears that came this time not of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude. "Okay," she said. That night, for the first time in her life, Elena slept in a real bed without fear. She lay in a clean, quiet room in David's spacious ranch house, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the wind in the trees outside. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of home. In the weeks that followed, the legal system moved with surprising speed. A lawyer, hired by David, informed them that with Jorge's detailed confession and testimony about the coercion and fraud involved in obtaining their mother's house, the original transfer of title was easily annulled. The house in town was legally Sophia's once more. They all drove there one last time. Sophia stood in the living room, looking at the furniture, the walls, the memories. "This house is full of ghosts," she said quietly. "Bad memories. My son, the man he became. I don't want to be here." She looked at David and Elena. "Sell it. We will use the money to rebuild our home, the right home." The trial of Luis Garcia was short. Jorge's testimony was damning. He recounted years of his brother's greed, his cruelty, his manipulation. But the most powerful moment came when Sophia took the stand. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She looked at her son, the one who had tried to kill them, with a devastating, heartbreaking dignity. "That man in the defendant's chair," she said, her voice clear and steady in the silent courtroom. "He is not my son. My son died a long time ago, replaced by a creature of greed and hate. I do not ask for mercy for him. I ask for justice for what he destroyed." The judge, a stern woman with kind eyes, delivered the sentence. "You have not just violated the laws of this state," she said, looking directly at Luis. "You have violated one of the most sacred bonds that exists, the bond between a son and a mother. You are a danger to your family and to society." Luis was sentenced to 25 years in a state penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for attempted murder, arson, and a list of other charges. Justice, final and absolute, had been served. With the money from the sale of the old house, they began to rebuild. On the same patch of desert, right where the old adobe had stood, a new house began to rise. It was a mirror of the old one in design, thick adobe walls, a simple, strong roof line. But it was new, and it was theirs. Elena threw herself into the project, not as a bystander, but as a builder. She learned how to mix adobe, how to frame a wall, how to read a blueprint. She discovered a passion and a talent she never knew she had. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the architect of her own future. As the house grew, so did her family. Leo took his first real steps on the new foundation, toddling straight into David's waiting arms. The bond between Elena and David, forged in crisis and tempered in shared work, deepened into a quiet, powerful love. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something far more solid, built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared history, and deep affection. One evening, when the house was nearly complete, David led her outside. The desert sky was a vast blanket of brilliant stars. He didn't have a fancy ring. He didn't have a prepared speech. He simply took her hands, his own calloused and strong, in hers. "Elena," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "when you came here, you gave me back my past. You gave me my father's history. You gave me a family, you and Sophia and Leo. You've made my life whole." He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple loop made of twine he had taken from Sophia's new garden. "You are the strongest, most incredible woman I have ever known. Marry me. Be my wife. Let's build this life together, for real." Tears of pure joy streamed down Elena's face. After a lifetime in a storm, she was finally home. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Years passed. The adobe house stood proud and strong, a beacon of warmth and life in the desert. The small construction business Elena and David started together grew into a successful company, known for building beautiful, sustainable homes throughout the region. They had another child, a daughter they named Isabella. Sophia lived to be 92 years old. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, in her own bed, surrounded by the laughter of her great-grandchildren. She had seen her family's legacy restored, its future secure. On the mantelpiece of the new fireplace, in the heart of their home, sat the old, charred wooden box. It was not a reminder of a painful secret anymore. It was a symbol of their foundation, a testament to a love that had crossed generations, and a fate that had led them all home. One warm evening, many years later, an older Elena and David sat on their porch, watching their own grandchildren play in the yard, where a desperate woman and an old woman had once run for their lives. They had used the profits from their business to create a foundation that helped other single mothers and families who had been unjustly displaced, turning their own pain into a well of hope for others. The journey had been born of cruelty and despair. The road that had seemed to be leading them into an empty, threatening nothingness had, in the end, led them home. The story of their family was a testament to the terrible cruelty that humans can inflict upon one another. But the house and the family within it was a far greater testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit and its profound capacity to rebuild, to forgive, and to love. No matter how dark the path, the destination could be brighter than they had ever dared to imagine. What did you think of this journey? This story teaches us that even when we are cast out into the desert of despair, we can find an oasis of hope and build a new life from the ashes of the old. The greatest treasures are not made of gold, but of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. If you believe in the strength of family and the power of new beginnings, comment with the word resilience. Thank you for listening. We hope this story has touched your heart. Leave your like and subscribe to see more touching stories like this one.